Human mind is the most complex object in the known universe. I say that, but these large language models are getting so complex and we're starting not to understand their behavior. I think that if you understand the mind in all of that depth and you have the computational capacity, you could make artificial brains that are on the level of complexity of the human mind.
So who are you?
I'm a professor at the University of Colorado. I'm also an author. I wrote a book in 2017 called The Knowledge Illusion. By training, I'm a cognitive scientist. So I study how people think and make decisions.
Okay. I found you through your TED Talk, your famous TED Talk. So I want you to start telling me about some stuff that you found fascinating about how people think that we don't normally know.
Yeah. So one of the major themes of my work, I just said my name of my book is The Knowledge Illusion. One of the major themes of my work that I've been interested in for a while is why we have such strong opinions about things that we don't understand very well. That was sort of a starting point for a lot of my research. What I came to realize is that across a huge variety of our experience in the world, we tend to think that we understand things a lot more deeply than we do. And that sort of gives us the feeling that we can maintain strong opinions about things. And we often don't realize that we don't know as much as we think. And so a lot of the time when we have really strong opinions about things, it can be based on this very kind of rickety foundation of not really understanding the issue in depth.
Can you give me an example of one thing that we usually think that we don't know, but we have no idea about how?
Yeah, I often love to use the example of a toilet. Some of the original work on this was done in the 1990s by a guy named Frank Kyle, who's a psychologist at Yale. And he ran studies basically trying to understand what people thought they knew about common household everyday objects. So you can imagine things like zippers or ballpoint pens or whatever it is, simple objects, simple machines that we interact with all the time in our day-to-day life. I love the example of a toilet. So we can sort of talk about that for a second. So in this experiment, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to just think about how well you understand something. So for instance, the toilet, how well do you feel like you understand how a toilet works? And I don't want you to think too hard about it. I want you to just sort of make that initial impression. Tell me about your initial impression. And
8 out of 10?
8 out of 10, perfect. Yeah. So that you're like most people, you're kind of nodding and you're like, yeah, I kind of know how a toilet works. But in the next phase of the experiment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to explain to me exactly how it works in detail. So walk me through the mechanism of exactly how it works. So do you want to actually try to do that?
Yes. So
okay.
You click the water that is above because of gravity or something, flows when you tap it. When you tap it, it goes and replace the water that is dirty, and the water that is dirty moves down through the pipe. But I just understood that I don't know a lot of things about toilets.
Okay, so you did a perfect demonstration of exactly what happens in the experiment, is that people say, oh yeah, I know how that works. They try to explain and they say gravity or something, right? Which is, if you want a very concise explanation, read the first chapter of my book, which we actually give this example and then we say, okay, here's how it actually works. I'm no plumbing expert, so I'm not going to try to explain it and make a fool of myself. But that's exactly the phenomenon that we're talking about. In general, we take in the world at a very coarse level of detail. We actually don't know how the world works very well at all. We have very shallow understanding of most things. It's true of so much of our experience in the world, there's really good reasons why that is. And that's sort of the starting point for this kind of journey of understanding a lot about the way that the mind works, what the mind evolved to do, why we argue about complex political issues, why people believe the earth is flat. I mean, there's so many different directions that you can take this stuff. And that's why it's kind of a really exciting area for me, for why I've gotten so fascinated with it, and why we wrote a whole book about it.
So is it evolutionary, the reason that we think we know and we don't know?
We believe, yes, that there is very important evolutionary aspects to the reason that we have this illusion. I can give you kind of a sketch out sort of the argument in a couple minutes, which won't really do justice to sort of the nuances, but let me try. So I'm just going to start by making the assertion that the world is just way too complex for any one individual to master really detailed information about almost anything. Look around the room right now. Think about all of the objects in the room that you're sitting in right now, and think about all of the complexity involved in making them work, sourcing the materials, all of this kind of stuff. And this is just the nature of the world. It's incredibly complex. And so if our minds were built to store huge amounts of detailed information about the world, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. There's just too much to know. And we're too often in novel environments where we've never experienced them before. So it's not like you can just store everything. So instead, what we are really built for is actually throwing away a lot of the details and trying to generalize and absorb deep principles about the way things work in a way that allows us to act adaptively in novel situations. So that's sort of the first part of the story. We're not built to store a lot of detailed information. In fact, our minds are really built for throwing away a lot of details and trying to extract the principles that are invariant across situations and across time. The second part of the story is the subtitle of the book, which is it's The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone. And
interesting.
The idea is that what's really special about human beings is not our capacity for individual thinking. In fact, it's our capacity to form into communities where knowledge is stored in the community, but not in individuals, but sort of spread across the community. And so we have specialization where each person maintains some special knowledge that they're the kind of the master of, the expert of. And we form into these communities, and we have built-in cognitive capacities for cognitive collaboration, something that no other animals have. That's what really is amazing about human beings. I mean, the fact that you and I can sit here and just have this conversation, kind of build on what the other one is saying and create something new, that's sort of where all the magic happens in human society. And if you think about anything we do in modern human society, it takes this massive distribution of effort where no one individual understands 1% of it, but the community sort of understands. And that's really what makes human beings special. So all of that leads up to the idea of, okay, we don't know that much about the world as individuals because we're really built for storing knowledge across our communities. That's the first step. The second step is, okay, so why do we feel like we understand things when we don't? Well, what we believe is that it's by virtue of participating in this community where the knowledge exists in the community. Just by virtue of participating, we get the feeling that we ourselves understand because we're sort of used to sharing knowledge. So I don't necessarily have to know something. If I know, I can just look it up or I can ask somebody who knows. So we have this very fluid sense in which we share knowledge across our communities. And just by virtue of doing that, we get the feeling that we ourselves understand when we don't. So a good example of this would be, everybody in your community is saying, such and such politician is terrible because they have some position on some issue. And you start nodding along and you're like, oh yeah, they really are terrible. And by virtue of that kind of nodding along process, and you start to feel like, oh, I know what everyone's talking about. I really understand this issue in depth. Just by participating in that community, there's kind of this contagious sense of understanding, we call it. And so that's where we think that the illusion comes from. It's because it's so natural for us to share knowledge, not just what's inside our head. We often fail to recognize where that knowledge resides. So it's a bit of a long story, but that's kind of the story that we believe is the correct one.
So basically, you are saying that knowledge. How do we use knowledge? How do we store knowledge? How do we transfer knowledge? It's kind of what made us evolve so much faster than the other animals.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's we have a chapter in the book on evolutionary psychology, and there's this idea from evolutionary psychology called the social brain hypothesis. So there's this big mystery in the anthropology literature, which is the question of why did modern humans evolve so quickly? And basically, if you look at anatomically modern humans, their brains are like way bigger than our hominid ancestors. That happened over evolutionarily a very short time. So there's been this very big puzzle in that literature to try to understand what was it that created that very rapid development that led to modern humans. And there's this idea called the social brain hypothesis, which is that it really had to do with maintaining with the necessity of being able to maintain social connections in groups and the cognitive capacities required for that. And then once you get into these groups, it kind of builds on itself because groups where you have distributed cognition are able to do really amazing things that individuals couldn't do. So they can develop culture, they can create technology, they can transmit information across generations. All of this kind of stuff kind of is a ratcheting sort of effect where once you have that ability to kind of share knowledge across a group, maintain social connections, all that kind of stuff, you get this kind of feedback loop where you can get smarter and smarter, both as individuals and as a group. So that's the very kind of maybe 30-second version of this idea of the social brain hypothesis, but it's one of the leading ideas about why intelligence evolved so rapidly in that period.
A lot of people say it. I heard again that is our ability to cooperate in large numbers that made us different than the other animals. But this is slightly different, a bit more advanced, and maybe a cooler explanation to this. Or this is the same thing you essentially say.
Yeah, I mean, just numbers is not sufficient for intelligence. Because a lot of animals hang out in large groups, but they don't hang out in large groups where they have such complex interactions and distribution of knowledge across the group. You do have some examples of this, like complexity emerging from groups with specialized skills. So I like to talk about bees, for instance. And if you look at a beehive accomplishes a lot of really complex tasks. So there's collection of food and nutrients. There's introduction of genetic diversity. There's protection of the hive. There's all this kind of stuff that happens in a beehive. But it's not because anyone's in charge. It's because you have specialization of skills that's evolved. And then you get really kind of complex behavior at the level of the group. Human beings are different because there is that individual cognition plus an ability to engage in really complex behavior across the group. So you do have you do have examples of coordinated behavior among animals. Like for instance, there's coordinated hunting in certain types of animals. You have some kinds of communication in animal groups, but human beings take that to a whole different level in terms of our ability to collaborate and really there's great work by a guy named Mike Tomasello who studies comparative psychology. So comparing what say young children do compared to other kinds of animals, like different kinds of apes and things. He has really kind of locked in on certain kinds of collaborative abilities that human beings have that other animals don't have. So for instance, as an example, there's this idea called theory of mind, which is I have to represent that somebody else has a mind. In order to know, say, if I want to collaborate with you in some way, I have to think about your mental states. Like, what is it that you want? What do you need? What do you desire? In order for us to collaborate, that actually takes a lot of cognition, because I have to actually represent you as having a mind and then make guesses about what's going on inside your mind. I can't just sort of like read you the way I would, some just purely physical system. So there's a good argument that in order to engage in the kind of collaboration that people engage in, you need to have certain kinds of very special cognition that other kind of animals don't have. If you're hunting in a pack, it might be that it's just, if I'm say a pack of fish looking for food, I might be able to do something simple, like just react to certain kinds of movements of the individual next to me, and you can get quite complex behavior. But what people do is much more in depth than that. It has to do with things like representing other people as thinking agents and so on.
Okay, so from now on, if someone asks us why humans took over the world in comparison to other animals, you say simply is because our ability to store and transmit information store and transmit information. Is that correct or no?
Across a group, I would say.
The
ability, well, I would say it's sort of like two parts. One is the ability to have that specialization where knowledge can be stored across an arbitrarily large group of people, and also stored in our technology and our devices and all that kind of stuff. All of that sort of superpowers the ability of what human beings can do. And then it's the ability to collaborate in a way that allows us to pursue arbitrarily complex goals. Like if you think about, in the Middle Ages, it would take hundreds of years to build a cathedral. And, you would have multiple designers that would be involved in that process over the course of the project. You'd have workers, you have so much distribution. There's not one person who's sort of in charge of everything, right? And that same kind of ability, that massively distributed effort is responsible for all of the amazing technology that we have in the world. Nowadays, someone might conceive a physics experiment and not even have the technology to do it for 50 or 100 years. And that's like this incredibly distributed, complicated task that eventually comes to fruition over, generations. Like doing something like that is really incredible. But that's where a lot of our technology comes from. It has to do with this incredible ability to collaborate in that way.
So you say about the illusion of knowledge, but you are explaining slowly that actually it's not an illusion. You actually know. You have in your disposal Google to search the information and understand it immediately.
Yeah.
So maybe what do you think about this?
The illusion is that we feel like we ourselves know the information. Not that, and I think that's right. It's like a lot of the time that information is accessible. So I give you an example. One of my former colleagues who have worked with quite a bit. He's a guy named Adrian Ward. He wrote a paper about how searching the internet inflates our sense of understanding, because basically we attribute the knowledge to ourselves instead of to. So, like for instance, if I ask you a trivia question, and then I allow you to search it on the internet, you search it. And then you look it up and then you might go, oh yeah, I knew that one, right? So like searching the internet makes you feel like you knew it because you have sort of access to it. But in his paper, what he does is he actually asks people to bet on how well they're going to do on another test without access to the internet. And people are highly overconfident because their feeling that they themselves understand becomes inflated just by virtue of having access to the internet. So there is an illusion there. But you're right. The illusion, we believe, stems from the fact that a lot of the times that information is accessible.
So How do you study this stuff? Like, do you put people's brain activity? You use brain scans while you ask them questions? Do you ask surveys?
Yeah.
How do you study all these things?
I personally don't do any, what you're describing is called fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. I don't do any work like that. I'm really a psychologist, cognitive scientist, and I run experiments and surveys. So basically, ask people questions or ask people to do certain kinds of behaviors and that kind of stuff.
Can you give me some examples? Like, how do you do one recent survey that you did, and like how you went about it?
Sure. Yeah. So we've been doing some research in collaboration primarily with one of my former students, by a guy by the name of Nick Light, who's at the University of Oregon. We've been doing research on trying to understand why people have counter consensus views on science. So why is it that people don't like genetically modified foods? Why is it that they don't like vaccination? Why is it that they deny climate change? That kind of stuff. And in that work, what we do is we look at three things. One is how strong are their counter consensus views. The second one is how much do they actually know about the issues, so objective knowledge. And the third would be their subjective knowledge. How much do they feel that they know? The main finding from that research, and maybe you could guess based on what I've said so far in our conversation, is that the strongest opinions are among the people who have the biggest gaps between how much they think they know and how much they actually know. So in a study in that stream of research, the kind of thing we would do would be to simply ask people their positions on certain issues. We would ask them to answer a bunch of questions about the issue, and we would figure out how much they actually know. And then we would ask them about their subjective knowledge, or how well do they feel like they understand the issues. So that would be a simple example. We could do that either in person or online, but that would be the kind of thing we would do. Now, your audience may or may not be familiar with the distinction between an experiment and a survey. That would be more of a survey, a correlational design, we sometimes call it. And an experiment, which is kind of more commonly the sort of thing I do, you would have different conditions in your experiment where both groups, if you might have multiple groups, they would see exactly the same thing, but sort of one thing would be varied across groups. And then you would see if the behavior was different in the two groups. And then you could sort of pinpoint that whatever it is that differs between the two groups is responsible for any differences in behavior. That's an experiment. So that's commonly the kind of thing I would do. Yeah.
A lot of times, for example, when you find that people have a big gap to what they think they know and what they know, can you predict other stuff with that? For example, how much money they have, how successful they are in life. Is this a big driving factor to be aware of what you know in life?
That's a great question. So, one thing that you have to do is, I'm sure your audience is familiar with the mantra that correlation doesn't equal causation. Yeah, I'm sure that you've probably heard that term before, right? Have you heard that before?
Nope.
Oh, you haven't heard that. Okay. Correlation does not equal causation. So A and B, two variables can be associated with each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that A causes B. So for instance, in your example, you say, are people who experience more of an illusion wealthier, or I'm sorry, less of an illusion wealthier? One particular interpretation of that would be that, having the illusion is bad and you make less money or whatever. But there's other possible interpretations for that. It could be reverse causality. Maybe wealthy people are less prone to the illusion for whatever reason. Another possible explanation would be what's called third variable causation or spurious correlation, where those two things, like having the illusion and having a lot of money, are correlated with each other, but it's by virtue of a third variable that's actually responsible for both. So maybe, I don't know, general intelligence predicts both of these things. So there's two questions you could ask. One would be, does having the illusion causally lead to certain kinds of things? And I don't know the answer to that because that would be a very hard study to run. And I don't think anyone's actually done those kinds of studies. Another thing would be, are there correlates that are potentially maybe interesting? So things that correlate with having more of the illusion or not. And there are some things. So age, for instance, gender. One that I find interesting is what we call an idea called cognitive reflection. And this is a test which is basically, this is work originally by a guy named Shane Frederick, who created this idea called cognitive reflection, which is an individual difference in psychology, which predicts how susceptible you are to kind of trick questions. So what he has was he created this series of sort of trick questions, and the first answer that pops into your head is wrong. And it's pretty easy if you stop yourself and you think a little more deeply to get the right answer. But most people just give the wrong answer that pops right into their head. And so they're less reflective. And less reflective people are more susceptible to the illusion. So I think that that's kind of interesting. Yeah. But in terms of...
So,
go ahead.
So basically, you can find correlations between other fields or you can predict stuff with their life, but like you are saying, usually you need to put other factors in as well to understand better if they are rich, that they answer this question, if they have a family, or how old they are.
You can find correlations between different variables that you measure and how susceptible people are to the illusion. What that data doesn't give you is the causality, what causes what. That would require a lot more in-depth kind of analysis or other kinds of study designs to try to figure out what causes what. Having money is correlated with a lot of things. It's correlated with socioeconomic status. It's correlated with educational attainment. It's correlated with what country you live in, all kinds of different stuff, general intelligence. So if it correlates with having less of this illusion, it would be pretty weak evidence to say that, having the illusion is bad for your wealth. You know what I mean? That would be kind of overinterpreting.
Now that you've seen all this stuff, I'm thinking about artificial intelligence and large language models that they are able to find So, for example, on YouTube, YouTube gives you a video that you probably would like to watch, like all the recommendations stuff, and how it interpret that you like it, like who knows, maybe it's because you charge your phone that time per night every night and correlate with the other people that they charge their phones or that at the same time, and how do you feel about the future of all this stuff and the future in your field of understanding a lot of things with the artificial intelligence now?
Yeah, I do think it's important to make a distinction between prediction and explanation. So if you have a ton of data like your YouTube and you have tons of data about people, you can probably make incredibly precise predictions about their future likes or behaviors and so on. That doesn't necessarily mean you can understand why. Sometimes you just have tons of data, you can kind of throw out the problem. You can make really fine-grained predictions, really precise predictions. In my world, often what we're trying to think through is actually trying to have simpler models that gives us some insight into what are the cognitive processes are actually going on. What's actually driving the behavior. Those are kind of different goals. And so artificial intelligence appears to be really incredibly good, especially with the amount of data that's available for making these kind of incredible incredibly precise predictions. I think, eventually we are going to get to the point where artificial intelligence gets so smart that it is really good at that understanding piece, trying to come up with more explanatory models of things. And it is starting to scratch the surface of that. That is still sort of the domain of people. But the pace at which artificial intelligence is getting better and improving is really kind of amazing. So I'm incredibly excited to see what the future holds, for that kind of stuff, for sure.
So why the why is important to understand? Like you're saying, that they can predict, but they don't know 100% why. Why one thing is doing what it's doing. So why is important?
Okay, so why is important for two reasons. One is I'm a cognitive scientist, and this is my job to understand, and build models of like how the mind works. And so inherently, I think we want to understand the mind. The other side of it would be the more you understand something, the better model you can actually build that kind of generalizes to new situations. So if you want to predict how someone's going to behave in a very different situation, the data that you're working with, like, if you take that person off of YouTube and you're no longer trying to just predict what kind of video they're going to like later, but you're going to try to predict something very different, you need to have generalization. So there, it's often helpful to understand in a deeper sense kind of what's driving behavior. You might not have the same variables available. You might be trying to predict something different. So having a kind of in-depth understanding of that, I think, is going to allow you to make models that kind of generalize outside of the domain in which you're doing what you're doing. A lot of nowadays, like prediction tasks on the internet are pretty specialized, because if I'm Netflix, I basically just want to know what should I recommend to people? What are they going to like? How can I increase engagement? Same thing on YouTube or Twitter or any other platform, But if, I ask a different question, like, how do you get someone to change their mind about a political candidate or something like that? Or how do you get them to be interested in a very novel product that's like nothing they've ever seen before? Those kinds of questions, they're a little trickier because it's not clear exactly what is the data that you would need to kind of put into your model to try to figure that out. I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm sort of just speaking extemporaneously off the top of my head.
It's very, 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 very interesting. I have a question about, so how complex you think? You think the mind is very, very, very complex or simple?
The human mind?
Yes.
Human mind is the most complex object in the known universe. So I would say complicated. I mean, I say that, but these large language models are getting so complex in and of themselves. Like you have neural networks that have, they're not on the order of like a brain, but they are huge and very complex. And we're starting not to understand their behavior, which is pretty amazing. But yeah, the human mind is the most complex object we know of in the universe.
And do you think there is a way to how we should go about and tackle this problem to understand the mind? Like,
well, we have this field. It's called, my field where I got my PhD is called cognitive science. And it's probably the most complicated field in all of the sciences, because you have everything from philosophers and linguists down to psychologists, neuroscientists, computer scientists, mathematicians, physicists. Everybody is working on the problem of how to understand the mind. And basically the answer is you can't just study it at one level of abstraction. You have to understand what is a particular single neuron doing? What are groups of neurons doing? How can you represent concepts in symbols? I mean, it just ranges. And then, like how do groups of individuals work together, and network analysis and all this kind of stuff. So you have to study this thing at so many different levels of analysis to really start to make headway. So there's not like one thing that you need to do to understand the mind. I mean, it's just this incredibly complex thing. And, all of these different areas are making progress, and you see it. I mean, you would not have AI, the development of AI, everything that's happening right now that's kind of exploded above the surface. It's like a iceberg. It's all based on incredible development of artificial intelligence, machine learning, all this kind of stuff that happened in the cognitive sciences over the last, 50 to 100 years. All of that stuff has been building to the point at which we've developed technology, which is really inspired by the mind, these neural networks, that's now just kind of exploded through the surface, where people are like, holy cow, that kind of came out of nowhere. And it didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, yes, the development of it reached sort of a level of sophistication, which is like shocking. But, people must have noticed that, 20 years ago, there was no such thing as sort of like, say, speech recognition. We didn't know how to solve that problem. And now you just speak to any device and it like almost understands you perfectly. I mean, it's incredible. So we have been seeing this for a long time, but people just didn't realize how profound it is until now. So we still don't know the first thing about how the mind works in a deep way. I mean, there is so much that we don't know. There's so much more that we don't know about the mind than there is that we do know. But the development of it is really exponential at this point. I mean, it's really amazing how that accumulated knowledge is starting to pay dividends.
Okay, very, very interesting. So you're basically saying that the way to tackle the problem of understanding the mind is by understanding individual neurons, then all neurons together, then the large behavior of so tackle all, see that up from above, from inside, from outside, from all the angles to kind of make sense of it.
I think it's so it's diversity across levels of analysis and diversity across methodologies. So, computer simulation, fMRI, human experimentation, all of these different methodologies that have been developed across all of these different fields all work together to sort of solve a piece of it. And then they're all studying the brain at like different levels of analysis. I mean, at some point, maybe in 100 years or 500 years or whatever it is, we will be able to understand things at each of those levels and really connect all the levels so you have a full understanding of this thing. But really, to have that full understanding, you have to understand at all of these different levels and with all these different methodologies. There's just so much to know.
What happens if we understand the brain fully? Like, can we create other conscious beings? What happens?
That's a really deep question. So I think that if you understand the mind in all of that depth, and you have the computational capacity, you could make artificial brains that are on the level of complexity of the human mind. That does not answer the question of consciousness, because consciousness is one thing that is completely mysterious still, and is really in the realm of philosophy. There are some theories out there about consciousness and where it arises from and how it emerges. But the truth is that it's something that's incredibly hard to understand, because it's very hard to tell if some other being has consciousness. How can you tell? Because consciousness is really this personal experience. It's this phenomenology of thought. And so to understand, I don't know, for instance, whether you're conscious. You could be just pretending. And the only reason I think you're conscious is because you are kind of acting the way that I act, and I know that I'm conscious. So consciousness is this incredibly hard thing, this very puzzling, mysterious thing. So we don't know that if you actually build an artificial brain that has the level of complexity of a human brain, of whether that would actually generate consciousness or not. Because we have no idea what consciousness is, where it comes from, why we have it, and all those kinds of big philosophical questions. Yeah.
So, but your sense is that this is a very, very important field, because if we understand how the mind works, maybe we can store our minds, and after 100 years, maybe they create they recreate us with our
Yeah.
DNA and our minds. Like you feel that this is probably one of the most important research that is being done now
I mean,
currently
that
on
is
the
an
mind.
amazing idea. Like theoretically, what we have inside of our skulls is a computer. And if you could reconstruct that computer, why shouldn't it be able to generate the same behaviors and activities and memories and all the kind of stuff that we have in our minds? So theoretically, yeah, like,
But
not
not
everyone,
but not consciousness.
well, we don't know. We don't know about consciousness. We don't know. That is the big puzzle. I think you ask most cognitive scientists, they don't believe, like most would not say that there's some magical spiritual energy beyond the generation of our thoughts from our mind. Most of them are kind of, I would say that they believe they're sort of the naturalistic explanations. They think that the mind is a computer of a type. And if you reconstructed that computer in some different substrate, you would generate the same kind of thought. So I think most cognitive scientists would believe that. Not all. Some do believe in sort of a more of a spiritual aspect of human existence that couldn't be replicated in a computer. But if you do believe that, it opens up these incredible ideas of that seem like science fiction, for sure. And I think those kinds of ideas, I mean, they raise a lot of really thorny and challenging and complicated philosophical issues that are mind really. I'm a big sci-fi guy. I love science fiction, and there's a lot of great sci-fi that is really connected with that idea of what happens once you can store a mind in a computer. I mean, it changes things dramatically. It's actually, there's ideas of, well, maybe physical existence ceases to be the way that advanced civilizations actually exist, and they all become simulations. And planets are basically dedicated just to being server farms for simulations where people can maintain their existence outside of the physical realm. And or maybe people can transport themselves through time, and I could go to sleep and wake up 1,000,000 years from now and see what's up. So like it just brings in all these incredible, not necessarily all good. Like some of these things might not be good, but they're very exciting and fun to think about for sure.
I didn't understand the example that you gave about the simulation. Like you're saying, basically, maybe we're living in a simulation, and that's the example.
I wasn't saying we're living in a simulation. That's certainly possible. That's not, I don't think so. Like I personally don't believe that we live in a simulation. But it's certainly possible, and some people think that it's more likely than not. What I was saying is that an advanced civilization that can really store a mind in a computer might decide that this physical realm that we live in is not as cool as like living in a simulation. And
Interesting.
yeah,
Now I understand. So you're saying basically, if we are able to store a mind to a computer, why not to live the in the cloud or something,
yeah,
and like
yeah.
be able to travel and like space travel or time travel and do all sorts of things that we biological stupid human beings can't.
Right. Yeah. If you could perfectly simulate experience, like, what's the point aside from being nostalgia or whatever of actually living in this physical body where we have pain and, we don't always get what we want and all these other kinds of challenges. I mean, I'm not saying I want that for society. I already get stressed out when my kids are on their iPads too much, but it is certainly a possibility to think of because, I mean, look at the way it is now. Like a lot of people want to spend a lot of their time just sort of sitting on their couch playing awesome video games. They love that. So like, why wouldn't a lot of people just want to like live fully in a simulation all the time where all of their desires are taken care of and all this kind of stuff. And you can do things you could never do in the physical world. I mean, it's certainly something to think about as a possibility.
And that will be solved when we understand the mind fully, maybe.
Yeah, I think like if you have a full accounting of the mind, you can create the technology to simulate it, and you have sufficient energy to create the computational power. Computational power is a matter of energy. Then yeah, those seem to be the building blocks for creating a simulation that would have that sort of level of realism.
I always thought about these scenarios, but now you put it into a picture and you say, oh, if we actually know exactly how a brain works and we put it to a cloud or whatever, then it makes sense, the simulation theory, because in my brain it's like, okay, simulation theory maybe is a bit far, but now that we are inside the simulation, now I can start imagining that. So you put like a bridge to this theory for me to start that.
You know, there is one caveat to that, which is that there's this idea in cognitive science which is called embodiment. And that's really the idea that a mind can't really exist absent a body. And that's because like a lot of the cognition takes place in our bodies as opposed to in our brains. You know, a lot of say like, you know, if you try to program a robot to walk across the street, it's pretty difficult without having the kind of limbs tuned properly to operate in that environment. So some of that cognition, we talk about this in the book, and you know, a lot of cognition actually takes place in the body. And so it might be that just like a vat, like a brain in a vat might not be sufficient. You might actually need to be embodied in some way. It might be hard to kind of simulate that.
Maybe you need a body in the simulation as well.
Yeah, right. So you might be able to like program the body, you know, in the simulation, not just the brain. I'm not sure. This is all getting into pretty philosophical stuff, but
yes, but if we found a way to simulate the brain, which is one of the hardest things ever, like probably we're going to find a way to simulate the body experience as well. So it can coexist together if one is a sufficient condition for the other.
And then I guess the other thing of it is what I was talking about earlier with the community. One mind is not enough to do anything. So you're really going to have also the idea to simulate the interactions between minds in the way that generates this massive distribution of knowledge and so on.
And it would be stupid it would be stupid for us not to create 100,000 different simulations and just see which one function better and like adapt the other stuff that like maybe in a way to think about it is like do evolution in a heartbeat, like to play 100,000 scenarios and we take only the one that works and like we just evolve rapidly so fast.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the heart of like what a lot of people think with why we might be in a simulation, because it does make sense that as a society becomes very advanced in terms of their understanding of neural computing and they develop really sophisticated computational solutions, that they will start doing more and more simulation. I mean, it's already happening on Earth. There's some huge amount of our energy capacity that is now going towards servers. I mean, some of it's doing kind of pointless stuff like mining crypto and so on. But as you start having more like AI, you know, like if
you are against crypto?
No. I'm just saying, it's not sort of driving like mining Bitcoin is not driving human understanding further, right? It's like pulling this kind of fake resource out of the earth or whatever. I'm not against that. I own some Bitcoin, you know, I don't have a strong like opposition to crypto or whatever. But my point is that, energy usage is going into computational power. Some of that is being used for things that are not like simulations and stuff, but a lot of it, like as AI, for instance, there's this gold rush going on right now to acquire the chips, you know, from NVIDIA and so on, and to develop these huge amounts of capacity that's necessary. Like, what's happening at Tesla right now. They're in this, I know that you hugged Elon Musk. I was kind of jealous. I kind of want to give that guy a hug at some point. But there is, they have this incredible plan of building up computational capacity there just so they can run bigger neural network models so that they can solve the self-driving problem. And so you're going to start to see more and more of that. And that means that more and more of our energy capacity is going to be going towards essentially simulation. So that's an exciting thing, I think,
So to be honest, this is what you're talking about. It came recently to my a word. I read a book, Cheap Wars, and I understood like the current goal of the 2023 is the chips that the farms of computational power run on.
Yeah.
So
right.
this is like, yes, it becomes now the most important thing is like fuel is like for the artificial intelligence, large language models. So you need not only fuel is the building block for.
Yeah. And it's a very specific kind of architecture. That's the thing that's special about it. And that's why NVIDIA is kind of winning the game, is because they have this very unique architecture, which is very good for this massively parallel kind of computation, which is what these neural network models are. They're massively parallel. A lot of things happening at the same time. And so I'm not an expert in this by any stretch, but there's a special kind of architecture that's needed for running these kinds of procedures, which is, Tesla's actually trying to develop their own chips and their own architecture that would be, I guess, I don't know if it's a competitor, but it's another. But right now, I guess NVIDIA is the only game in town in terms of that kind of computation for doing very efficient computation at scale of these large neural network models. That's why they're, everybody's beating down the doors to try to buy their chips.
So I'm curious to hear you personally in your life. How do you speed up learning? How do you learn personally? Is by meditation? Is by doing showers, cold showers? I don't know.
I'm actually very good at learning, which I think is probably my greatest skill. For instance, I'm very into music. I play music a lot. And so I'm often thinking about learning. And what is it? I think it's like a focused attention to getting out of your comfort zone. And because it's physically hard. I said a lot of people like to sit on their couch and play video games. And it's like the better you get at a video game, actually the easier it becomes because everything becomes automatic. But a lot of learning is taking yourself out of that, and then learning something new is mentally and cognitively demanding. People tend to like to not engage in that cognitive effort. And so they don't do it. But if you engage in that cognitive effort, the process of learning is taking something that at once feels difficult and then making it automatic. That's what a lot of learning is. And so I think people end up, I see a lot of musicians who play the same thing, do the same thing for 50 years or whatever, and they never get better. They never get substantially better. But if you have sort of a focused energy on, I'm going to try something new, learn something new, and kind of finding that and not get discouraged. You have to stick with it until it sort of clicks in. That seems to be the key. And then I guess the other thing that I'm often telling people, especially with music, is you can't look at a goal. Like if you look at the person who's the best guitar player on the planet or whatever, and you're like, I want to be like that, you're never going to get anywhere. Because it's just too daunting. Instead, if you say, compare yourself to yourself yesterday, did I get 1% better? And if you get 1% better every week at something, you're going to look back 10 years from now and this is for something where it's a lifelong pursuit. You look back 10 years and you're like, holy shit, I've come a long way. So focusing on the right comparison, I think, is really important. You got to compare yourself to where you were previously and always just keep motivation. And then if those two things are the important ingredients, I think, for the kind of learning I like to do,
I have here in my door, when I go in and out, the only person you compare yourself with yourself yesterday. And I find,
Oh, really?
I, I find this to be kind of so, refreshing, like to my mental state in a way, because it's so frustrating and there is so many people to compare yourself.
Totally.
But
Totally.
because I'm a YouTuber, I can see always a person doing better than me. And when I thought that, okay, the biggest YouTuber in the world doesn't have problems like that. But then I met him, I became friends with him, and I understood, yeah, maybe he doesn't have problems like that in that particular area, the YouTube area.
Yeah.
But when it comes to business and money, he feels the same thing, frustrated that he's stupid in comparison to the other people. So it's a game that you are frustrated and you always lose. But if you, the game that with yourself, it's comparing with yourself, but it's difficult a bit to remember always to compare with
You know,
yourself.
I often tell my brother and I have this conversation a lot, and life has a lot of ups and downs. You know, it's like this. There's a lot of volatility in life. But if you just focus on the trajectory, you know, life is long. And if you have an upward trajectory to your life, you're going to look back. So like, you just have to make sure you're moving in the right direction. That's all. And then not stress too much when you have downs, highs and lows, you know, because there is volatility in life. But if you're just moving in the right direction slowly over time, making the right kind of choices, then, you know, you're going to get to an amazing place eventually in your life. I mean, a lot of people will, not everyone will. I mean, you know, you have to figure out what it is that you're good at, and you have to be a good person and make good choices and all this kind of stuff. But I do think a lot of stress comes from the wrong comparisons. And then also, like, you know, we have this idea in psychology called the hedonic treadmill, which I don't know if you've heard that term before, but hedonic treadmill basically means that you adapt to everything. Hedonics just means how you feel about your life or whatever. You adapt to everything. So it's like, you know, you have this amazing life and all of a sudden it's not as good as your neighbor. You know, your car's not as fancy as your neighbor or whatever. But, you know, a year ago, you would have like been so happy with where you are, but now it just doesn't feel good because you say, have adjusted to this new level of consumption. You always want more and more and more. Or you're now, because you have this higher level of consumption, you're surrounded by other people who have nicer stuff than you or whatever it is. And so that leads to so much unhappiness. And I don't really know the solution to that because human beings are inherently...
I know.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know.
Let's hear it.
So I do this purposely. So maybe once every 2 months, once every month, I go maybe homeless for 5 days for a YouTube video, but I come back to the low and I remember that, or I did a video, 30 days with no food. And so you bring down yourself to the bottom again, you adjust and you find happiness. So being able to artificially makes, or maybe when you exercise very hard and you increase the exercise and come back. So something like that, I think, is the closest I got to answer your question.
I mean, that's great. Yeah. Like then you feel thankful again. But you know, no matter what you do, your mind is always going to come back to sometimes being unhappy, you know, or stressed or anxious or whatever. I've kind of come around to that. And you just have to accept it. And I think there are practices about just being grateful and trying to make better comparisons and just to think more and value what you have. And then, you know, there's other things as well. But, I mean, I have an amazing life. I live in the most beautiful place in the world in Colorado. I'm a tenured professor. I have basically my dream job that I've, you know, like, you know, if you ask me like, what's the perfect job for you earlier in life, I've got that. I spend a lot of my time traveling around to amazing places and doing cool stuff and playing music. And I've got 2 amazing kids and everything. And yet I'll wake up in the morning some days and just be like, man, you know, I'm just not feeling emotionally good. And it's completely stupid, you know? for whatever reason it is. I'm anxious about something. I'm missing something. There's something I want in my life that's not there at the current moment. So, you know, like, I think it's important for other people. Like you said, you met with, who was it, Mr. Beast or somebody, some bigger YouTuber than you, and you learn that, yeah, their life's not all perfect, you know, just because they got to that certain level. And I think having awareness of that everybody struggles.
Not more perfect. Maybe it's less because they went and adjusted to their circumstances is, and now they just have so many more problems than you do. So maybe they are less. I'm not saying.
No, I mean, there's truth to it. Like, the vision we get of other people's lives. I mean, you're a YouTuber, so, and a social media person and all this. You know, you know that the vision that you see of other people's life online is not reality. Because it's just the best moments that are curated. And so that makes other people feel really bad, you know, so I think that is one of the most noxious aspects of online life, is that we get this vision of other people's lives where we don't see the hard things and everything. And it gives you this false impression that everybody's living this perfect, beautiful life. I think that that's a very corrosive aspect of social media. So I think, like, you know, having people be aware of that is important. You know, it's like you might see the glitz and the glamour, but everybody struggles. Every human being on the planet struggles. You know.
Since we're in the topic, I'm curious to understand, like, how your work on becoming influence your personal life. Do you think you have an edge to figuring life in the mind, and maybe you are more easily manipulating other people, not in a bad way or a negative way, or make them collaborate with you? Or, like, do you think your work gives you an edge to your life?
I mean, so, like, one thing is, it's definitely made me better in relationships, I think, and in some ways better in relationships, and definitely I'm better in terms of being open-minded to other perspectives. That's something that human beings are really bad at. We want to argue about stuff. We think we're right a lot of the times, you know. I think I've gotten much better at being a little more humble intellectually when it comes to complex issues, and being able to acknowledge that I don't have all the details, being able to acknowledge that, okay, this issue is complicated and there's no black and white view. I mean, it's rare to come across an issue where there's a black and white, where, like, X is right, Y is wrong. Half of the people are just dead wrong. I mean, sometimes you see it, but it's more rare than anything. And so I think I have gotten better about that, about being more humble intellectually, being more open-minded, being better about listening, and not have that sort of toning down that side of me, that voice in my head that says, oh, that's stupid, whatever that, this other person saying that's dumb or whatever, like, not listening to that voice as much, and then just sort of listening more curiously, and trying to be more open-minded in that way. I don't like to think about what I do as being a conduit to manipulating people. I like to think of it as a conduit of finding, like, mutual value maximizing solutions. So, like I love to teach my students about this idea. For instance, I just used the word hedonic. There's this idea in behavioral economics called hedonic editing. This is a little bit of a random tangent, but my students always love this idea because it's very simple. But basically, it's a way of saying, like, how can you combine decisions together in a way that feels better? And I'll go off on a little bit of a tangent here to explain it to you. So, for instance,
please,
yeah, we have this idea called diminishing marginal utility. Okay, and what that means is that, like, something might feel good, and then if you, like, double that thing, it feels good, but not as good. Okay. And so, for instance, if I give you $100, that feels really good. If I give you $200, that feels really good too, but it's not quite double $100. It diminishes. Okay. So you have this kind of curve of called diminishing marginal sensitivity. The same thing is true in the domain of losses. So, like, $100 feels really bad, $200 feels really bad, but not double $100. There's also this thing called loss aversion, which you might have heard of, which is that like losing $100 feels worse than getting $100 feels good. We're like very sensitive to losses. So the idea of hedonic editing is that can we combine things in a way that doesn't feel as bad, but doesn't actually change anything, but just changes how we feel about it. That's hedonic editing. And a great example of this would be the all-inclusive resort. Okay. So if $100 feels like a loss to you, you go to that resort and it's like, okay, I'm going to buy drinks at the pool bar, $100. Oh, I got to take my wallet out. That sucks. And then I go to dinner. It's $100 again. Oh, that sucks. So you're like re-experiencing that initial part of the loss curve that's very painful. But if instead I pay the resort $1,000 at the beginning of the trip, I might only consume $800 worth of stuff. But when I pay that $1,000, it doesn't feel that bad because I'm sort of on the shallower part of that loss curve. Are you seeing the logic of this?
Yes. So you are going to not feel 10 times bad during the week. You are going to feel one time bad, maybe a bit more, but slightly more bad in the beginning of the week that you went to the resort.
I mean, this is why people like all-inclusive resorts, not because it's necessarily a good deal. But to me, that's not fooling people. That's like this mutually beneficial arrangement between the consumer and the business. The business gets a little bit more money and they get more satisfied customers. And they're not really tricking them because the customers are just like, I get to go off to wherever and just not worry about money the whole time. And it's like a great feeling. It's awesome. So like, that's what I think of, which is if I understand the psychology of that kind of thing, you might be able to find mutually beneficial arrangements between the stakeholders where the psychology really helps both parties. And it's not like a trick. I don't like tricks, you know. The marketing gets a bad rap when it's about snake oil, you know, when it's about tricking people into behaving in a certain way because I know how you tick. I don't like that kind of stuff. I think that the way businesses operate, especially in this day and age, business is not about tricking someone in a one-off transaction, but it's about customer lifetime value. It's about building a relationship with a customer over the long term. And if you trick a customer, you're not really providing value. You might trick them once, but they're not going to come back to you, you know? So finding these kind of long-term solutions where understanding the psychology of the consumer can help the business to really cater to that customer in a way that benefits both parties. That's the way I think about kind of the way I like to use psychology. It's not to trick people. It's to like, yeah, like if I can understand psychology so that when I get into a dispute with my partner or whatever, I know better how to make them feel better. It might be understanding their psychology in a way that is like, in a way, a little bit of kind of a trick, but it benefits both of us because I care about that person. I don't want to trick them. What I really want to do is to try to find a solution that's going to work for both of us in our interaction. Anyway, that's the idealistic version. I don't always succeed to be this kind of like, this, I don't always succeed in my relationships in that way, but that's what I aspire to.
So you mentioned that your work gave you a bit more on an edge on relationships. Can you, maybe with your wife or something, can you elaborate what some tips and tricks that you found?
Well, I'm divorced, so I'm not sure people should listen to me. But I do think that shutting off this thing of one person has to be right and one person has to be wrong, and a dispute or a disagreement is about trying to like adjudicate who's right and who's wrong and coming to some agreement about that. Like usually that's not what it's about. So I do think that I have gotten better at understanding that for sure, you know?
So how do you get in the conversation, let's say with your sister or with a person that you have an argument, like you agree, okay, first of all, let's come from a place of understanding and not conflict? Like how do
Yeah, I
you
think
go
it's a place of
about?
understanding. It's like both people have good intentions. That's a starting point. And really, like, this person really sees the world through a different lens than you do. They understand the situation completely differently because their model for understanding the world is different from yours. What they actually experience might be different from what you experience, all that kind of stuff. So, like, I think finding a way to transmit that information so that you can really see it through the other person's eyes and they can see it through your eyes, finding some way of some dialogue, some structure for a dialogue of being able to do that. That's really hard, and it can be very painful, and it can be boring. It
And
can
it
be whatever.
requires two people to
Yeah, both
put
people have to
effort.
participate. Absolutely. But diffusing the tension of we're going to try to argue about who's right and who's wrong. I mean, usually it's not the right way to go, you know? Um, that is one thing that I've learned. And then just trying to like, we're naturally defensive and we try to protect ourselves in interactions. You know, we're naturally defensive. And so it's like trying to somehow stifle that defensiveness and that need to like prove that you're right. That's really hard. That, you know, all the Buddhists will tell you, it's like, you know, just sort of letting go of that is so hard, but it's like critical, you know? But if you love another person and you care about them and you care about the relationship, trying to understand what makes them tick, why it is that they feel the way that they do and all that, you know, not everybody is reasonable, but maybe you don't want to have such a relationship, such a deep relationship with someone who's unreasonable until they learn and evolve as a person to be reasonable. But maybe you do love them and you just have to say, okay, look, here's what I'm going to say to you. Like, here's the way I see it. Take that for what it's worth. Let's change the topic for now, but I want you to just like try to think about that a little bit. And let's not try to adjudicate this completely right now. Let's like pause and maybe go away from each other for a little while and allow us to absorb this and diffuse and like take the tension down, not be so emotional. You know, when there's a lot of emotion involved in a dispute, often that doesn't help, you know. Those
I
emotions can be
think
really hard.
at that moment that you are describing this thing, because you are defensive and you are afraid maybe they will offend you, or you are afraid that they will win the argument, will look stupid. When you said that, I was like, oh yes, that feeling. That,
Yeah.
and it's kind of it's kind of a horrible feeling in a way for the conversation. If you just accept and like remove your ego right then and there, that okay, it's okay. If I get insulted, I will still be a human. If they make fun of me, I will still be a human. Like, you shut up and like you let the other person like no, yes. So that's a great advice for
I
for
mean, it's
me
easier said than
personally.
done. Easier said than done, absolutely. But if you can achieve that, it is better for sure. You know, most arguments are kind of misunderstandings, I believe. You know, so a lot of it is trying to like get the two parties or multiple parties to kind of see that everybody has good intentions. Like they don't want to fight, they don't want to be in a disagreement, they don't want to be, you know, um, yeah, and that often things are complicated. That's like the theme of all my research in my book and everything. Like often things are complicated. You know, they're not so black and white. They're not so simple. There is nuance there. So yeah, that's kind of my
Do you
recommendations.
have people or students coming and asking your advice about stuff, like in about their lives or what to do? Because like you you seem like you're a psychologist or something like that. It's like, especially me, I was drawn to you. You are like a persona that drawn to maybe ask for advice. So
Yeah.
do you have a lot of this stuff? People asking you, or your friends and family, or your students asking you for advice?
You know, sometimes I guess my students, I have a mentorship relationship with them. So I often, and going through a PhD is a hard time. You know, a lot of PhD students struggle with their emotions. They struggle with depression, anxiety, all these kinds of things. So I've had a lot of mentoring relationships in my career where I am trying to provide some advice to students on how to listen, sort of like thrive in that environment. That's often very hard because it's just a hard period of life. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty and all that. In terms of like people asking for my advice interpersonally, that does happen to some extent. Um, and sometimes I give it unsolicited, I guess. I've tried to like start doing that more for some reason, you know, to give people advice sometimes in an unsolicited way, but that can be risky. You know, that's scary to do because not everybody reacts to it well. So, you know, I mostly stick to situations where people ask me for advice. But no, I don't try to play like life coach with people, unless they ask for help very often, you know. Because like I kind of feel it's part of this thing of being more humble. Like I'm often trying to figure out my own life, you know, and I think I should ask more for advice more. I've started to do that a little bit, you know, like I think that's part of being humble as well, is to actually ask for advice. Like throughout my life, I've always kind of thought that I've got things figured out better than most people when it comes to the things I'm dealing with because I've thought about them more deeply and I'm like a pretty smart person. But often it is valuable to kind of have a fresh perspective. And often, like when you get that advice, that yeah, again, that voice says, that person doesn't really know what they're talking about. But then if you kind of like try to inhibit that and, you know, wait and slow down and then just think about it over and over again, sometimes that advice is useful because it comes from a person who's outside of the perspective. They might see what you're doing or what you're experiencing in a different way, you know. I will say the caveat to this is music. I'm always trying to solicit advice musically, which is hard because a lot of people are defensive about their music. So what that means is that a lot of musicians don't give feedback or advice very often because it's often taken the wrong way because people are defensive. But the only way to get better at music is really to understand where your weaknesses are and where your blind spots are. So I'm always trying to ask people for advice musically. Not necessarily like, oh, this person has all the answers, but they see what I'm doing from a perspective that I can never see. I mean, I can watch a video of myself, I can listen to a recording, but they're a kind of an objective observer of the music. So getting outside advice on what you're doing musically is like super valuable, but it's really hard to come by. So I try to solicit
You
that.
spoke so many times about music. Can you explain me like what music you do and what you like?
Yeah. Bluegrass music. I'm like a total bluegrass music fanatic. I sing, I play guitar as my main instrument. I play banjo, poorly, and I play fiddle, like very poorly. But it's a huge part of my life. Yeah. So I think a lot about music a lot, you know. We're sitting here right now. I never have my guitar more than like 6 inches away from my computer because, you know, whenever I have a little bit of free time, I always grab my guitar and start playing. So, yeah.
And what does that mean to your life? Is it like a way for you to think deeply? Is to for you to express yourself? How does that play a role in your life?
I guess it's like one, it's this thing I talked about before about learning. It's a lifelong pursuit where you can always get better. And so it's incredibly gratifying to me to get more and more musical over time. Music is like this infinite thing. However good you get and however much you learn, there's an infinity of things to learn more. And there's so many places to go. So it's like this lifelong pursuit where I feel like I'm constantly getting better. And it's opening doors and enriching my life. Number two is the social connections that it creates, because playing music with other people is the most amazing experience. One of the most amazing experiences of my life. It's one of the most fun things to do. I play music with my friends. I play music with my daughter. It's amazing from that perspective. And I guess the third thing is it's created these incredible experiences in my life. So, I made friends with bluegrass players in Europe. In April, I went to Europe. I played music with my European friends. They're coming here in August, and then I'm going to another music festival in France in the Alps. I did a sabbatical in Spain where I played music while I was out there. So I made some of my best friends in the world play music, and they're scattered around the world. And then when I go off to these places, I get to be in these new environments, you know, like I'm going to the Alps and I get to play music with my friends and meet local people, like real Europeans, not really be a tourist, but be like know people, the real people. And that's like the most amazing experience. That's the most amazing way to see the world that I could think of. And so music has enriched my life so much, and I get so much out of it. And that's why I think I love it so much.
If I give you $1 trillion, how do you spend it to have maximum impact?
$1 trillion?
Yes.
Holy cow. That's a lot of money. What would I do with $1 trillion?
You can probably buy a hack from Elon Musk as well.
I mean, okay, so what do I see as like really exciting in the future? Like, I do think that the development of artificial intelligence is incredible, like for the sci-fi possibilities. I have always been very interested in space and space science. So you see why I like Elon Musk, you know? So I am very much excited about humanity's next chapter in terms of understanding our place in the universe. Those are the two things that are really exciting to me. I also do believe that in terms of humanity's welfare and well-being, there's like two things. One is just the well-being of human beings. And I do think AI is a big part of this, because AI is going to unlock economic activity in a way that is going to create a society of abundance. That's going to happen anyway, unless we don't blow ourselves up or something. If you look at the size of the world economy, going back to like 2000 BC, it's just this perfect, it's exponential. And the way that an exponential curve works is that things change in a percentage way, not a absolute way. And what that means is the implications of that are tremendous. What that means is that an economy that is, say, the size it is now, in 10 years will be X percent bigger. And then 10 years after that will be another percentage bigger. And the implications of that are crazy. So for instance, if you add up all of the largest economies, largest businesses on earth 10 years ago, maybe they're worth $1 trillion. Now they're worth 10 trillion. 10 years from now, it'd be worth 100 trillion. And then another 10 years, it's a quadrillion. So the implications of that in terms of, say, per capita GDP or whatever your world GDP or whatever, the implications of that are incredible. What that means is that every human being on earth should have more than enough if we're able to allocate that economic activity in a somewhat reasonable way. That means an era of abundance where people don't go hungry. Everybody lives like kind of a comfortable life and all that kind of stuff. That's like well-being. I'm going to ramble a little bit. Well-being is not enough because like we do judge ourselves by our neighbors. So if everybody's now has all the good stuff, like people are not just
lock people in their houses without any interaction with the other people.
Right. Well, I don't think that's going to make people happy either. But so people might not necessarily be happy because they're going to see their neighbors who have more than them, and that's going to make them happy. But we will be in this era of abundance where we should have universal basic income. Everybody's going to have their needs met, and so on and so forth. You shouldn't have poverty on Earth in the next, I don't know what the number is, but 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever. But you still need the innovative edge of human beings, which is to create new things, to try new things, to not just sit on their couches and play video games where everybody's just fat and happy. That's the other ingredient of like exciting things in humanity. And I think that where's that innovation? Well, it is kind of like science fiction. And that's another thing about Elon Musk. He's taken with science fiction in the same way that I am, which is we have to have something to be excited about. And I think like the next chapter of life, thinking about, wow, like what could our deeper understanding of the mind open up in terms of new opportunities, and then understanding our place in the universe, space travel, all that kind of stuff. That to me is very exciting as well. So I don't know, like having $1 trillion, that seems like almost too much money. I wouldn't know what to do that. I would probably squander it in some way. But that would be
I want you to be more specific. I give 1 trillion to space exploration. I create a company that travels to space. I give 1 trillion to the well-being of, or I create a universal basic. Like, give me more detail.
Okay, how about like I don't know that this would be it, but I think like if you could build a space elevator, that would be pretty amazing, because that would change. I mean, SpaceX is trying to do this with landing the rockets, but there's like an even greater order of magnitude change in the accessibility of space by virtue of having a space elevator. So if you could pull off the space elevator, that to me like would open things up in an amazing way. Okay, so that's my answer. Let's build a space elevator.
So you go get inside and you go to Mars with an elevator like you get in the...
You wouldn't go to Mars. It would just go to orbit.
Orbit, and then there is another elevator that goes to Mars.
Yeah, I mean, like the way they talk about the elevator is really like there's some counterweight in space. It would be probably an asteroid or something, and you just have this big like thing that's attached, and you basically just ride it up. You just ride up to space, and that would reduce the cost of accessing orbit. Like once you're in orbit, it's fine because. And like, even if you're on Mars or the moon or something, the gravity well is not nearly what it is on Earth. So accessibility to the rest of the solar system and beyond becomes much easier once you develop some space-based kind of, we're way outside of my area of expertise right now. So I'm talking just based on my sort of like, lay interest in this kind of stuff.
No, but you're very excited and you have a lot of passion for it. So
I am excited about that. I do love space and aliens and all that kind of stuff. I've always been really into that. Yeah. So,
what do you want to leave behind in this world?
My legacy. I don't really think about that very much. Like I focus on being a good person and like making sure my kids have a great life, and then trying to make my own experience on this earth as filled with new experiences as possible. That's what I'm focused on right now. I don't really think about my legacy. And I think that by following that, I will have a good legacy. Because people will remember me as a good person. And I've already done, look, I guess like I don't think about, I feel like it's a little self-centered to think about my legacy. Like I've already had an amazing life, and I feel like I've written a book, and I've had all these cool experiences, and I've gotten, I've had like amazing kids, all this kind of stuff. Like, I don't think I really need anything beyond that. Talk to me in 20 years and maybe I'll be thinking about that more. Like, what do I leave behind? But really, like, I just have always followed my nose in my life and tried to be a good person and try to work on problems that I find exciting and interesting. And I try to give to other people, give experiences to other people, like my children or my friends, and be like a generous person. And I feel like for me, that's enough. And if I started thinking about my legacy, I feel like that would stress me out. I'm already stressed enough about trying to accomplish the things that I want to accomplish. I don't need the additional stress of feeling like I have to worry about what it is that I leave behind.
So basically you're saying that by not thinking about your legacy as well, we'll create a better legacy as well.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not something I really think about. And that might just be a matter of like, I haven't gotten to that stage of life yet where I start thinking about that, And maybe it's also just because I'm this radical optimist and I just like, part of me doesn't believe that I'm going to ever die, Like, of course I am, but part of me doesn't ever think about that because I'm an optimist. I like to think about the present. I like to think about the excitement of my life. I don't like to dwell on leaving the earth and what it is that I would leave behind, you know?
On the last question is, do you, so there is a lot of young people probably that are listening this podcast. So this is a stolen question from the Lex Friedman podcast, but
I like that podcast.
yes, what advice do you have for young people like me and like other people? I'm 23, that will have a life that we will be proud of.
A life that you're proud of. Yeah, I guess like I've already said it, which is focus on the trajectory. You know, just make sure you're making good decisions and heading in the right direction in terms of where you want to go in life in small steps. Don't think about the destination and trying to get there all right away. But I do think you need to think about the future and where it is that you want to end up, and to try to chart a course of like, what is the small steps I'm going to take that I'm going to head in the direction of that goal. And then I think like another thing is like, be a good person, because life is not transactional in the way that people think it is. A lot of the time, like it's not a zero-sum game. Like actually listen to the Lex Friedman with Mr. Beast. Who is that? Do you know this? Do you know him?
Yeah.
So like he said some things that I thought were really interesting. Like he seems to be a very generous with his time in ways that it's not immediately apparent how that's going to benefit him. And I actually think like that is a great advice. Like when I give, like I don't always take this advice. Like so I get random emails from people that I don't know quite often who are saying like, you know, I'm a student in, you know, whatever country and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I don't answer those a lot of the time just because I don't have the bandwidth to do it. But just giving of yourself, of like to help another person, if you make a habit of that over your life, it redounds to your benefit. Actually, it's like over the long term, it's a totally rational thing to do. Because if you just give out good energy and positive energy into the world, people are going to like you. And being liked, people don't realize how important that is to a career. Like being liked is really important, and people like other people who are positive and generous and all that kind of stuff. So I would just try to say like, just try to be like a good person, try to be positive, and then like, do not stress about trying to be somewhere all at once. Realize that life is long, and that if you're on the right trajectory over time, you're going to get to where you want to go. Definitely. Hope that's good, guys.
It's the best way to close this. So I love you. Thank you for your time, for being here. And guys, subscribe to this podcast, and I put the book down in the description. Go buy it and watch more of his TED Talks and all this stuff to learn more about his field. Thank you guys for watching. Bye-bye.